Well, welcome to the second part of our discussion at the Institute of Digital Culture Data Summit. So I've got a brilliant panel here today. We've got Tom Crick from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. We've got Becky Coberod from the Smithsonian Museum. We've got John White from The Space. And we've got Carolyn Royston from Surface Impression. And we've also got Kevin Gosling from the Collections Trust. So my name is Will Darler. I'm an Associate Professor of the University of Leicester School of Business and also a Fellow for the Institute of Digital Culture. So the first thing I'd like you to all say a few words about is, could you please introduce your institutions and also maybe talk a little bit about how digital technology and technologies like AI have changed and are still changing the cultural sector?
Yeah, no worries. So hello, everyone. So Tom Crick, I'm a professor at Swansea University of Digital Policy at Swansea University. I guess my main role is Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. So a very broad remit in that sense. So there's probably the sense of what does a Chief Scientific Advisor perhaps slightly kind of incongruously kind of do for culture, media and sport, but a very, very broad portfolio from gambling regulation to kind of cutting across the arts, humanities, kind of culture and heritage sector, as well as sport and culture and creative industries. So there are very clear sort of digital data-driven and computational aspects to all of that, and certainly the kind of datafication angle, both as a citizens and civic society bit, but also the kind of potential impact of copyright IP on creative industries and ensuring that I guess really pushing that citizen-centered, kind of human-centered aspect to some of these kind of considerations in the wider context of the UK, trying to, being a global leader, like identifying its USP from a kind of research, development, innovation and growth perspective and how that aligns to kind of government missions and everything else. So I guess on the second part of your question, so I have a slightly kind of amorphous ownership of AI and innovation for the department. So that there's clearly I'm the senior scientist. I provide all of the kind of underpinning R&D and evidence and sort of scientific capability in the department. So providing the evidence to support high quality policy making. But I guess we recognise, the ongoing disruption, both positive and negative, from I guess the sort of digital and data economy. What does that mean for citizens, communities and civic society, but also the opportunities around things like culture and creative industries. So recognizing that there, a technology adoption and diffusion, what this means for things like industrial strategy, particularly for the creative industries, kind of key government priorities around like kind of growth and the other government missions, but also kind of more broadly, I guess, things like the AI Opportunities Action Plan that was published in January. So, recognizing that you're trying to it's a sort of constrained optimization problem. You're trying to balance loads of competing, national and international interests, and that's become increasingly like geopolitical as well as sort of techno-solutionism. But I guess the thing that we really want to try and push, like, what does this mean? What's the impact on citizens and society? So will the benefits of AI tools and technologies be enjoyed equitably and equally across kind of different demographies, kind of communities, and across the entirety of the UK? And I guess that real kind of citizen-centered, kind of human-centered aspect to some of these things, as well as ensuring that the UK is seen to be a kind of a global leader in this space. So I'm keen to pick up some of those threads of what that means for kind of culture and heritage and the creative industries. And I guess I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about AI and other fun stuff as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Tom. Becky.
Yes, hi, I'm Becky Coberod. I'm the head of digital transformation at the Smithsonian Institution. And my role in office was established in 2021 to really help drive the Smithsonian's future in how we're considering the use of data and technology to advance our mission and connect with the world. And we look across the Smithsonian's 21 museums and dozens of research centers, libraries, archives, education centers, to consider broadly how do we think about economies of scale, but also innovation pilots and really driving some of these changes that are happening around us and really impact not only the Smithsonian, but the sector in the States. And that includes everything from thinking about how we can make our collections and all of our assets accessible, how we think about the discovery and finding new knowledge that can help us better understand ourselves and the world around us, how we're engaging with our audiences, knowing and serving them better, and finally, how are we investing in our workforce as well as the sector and helping them grapple with these changes and understanding the skills that they need to continue to do the jobs that they are doing, as well as understanding the world around them so that they can help the public also grapple with those changes. So a big part of that as well includes thinking about our partners, not only in the States in terms of the cultural sector, but also internationally, and thinking about the partners and how we can actually learn from each other and connect the dots in some of the things we're all grappling with, so we can advance the sector writ large.
Thank you very much, Becky. And John?
Yeah, hi, I'm John White, Chief Operating Officer of the Space. We were set up by the Arts Council BBC about 11 years ago. We're a not-for-profit that exists to help cultural organisations, and typically we focus on small to mid-scale organisations, engage audiences using digital technology and broadcast media. And we do that through commissioning projects. So we've commissioned and supported more than 500 digital and broadcast projects since we were set up, but also through mentoring, training, and then we look at particular strategic challenges that the sector is facing and try and help them think around those barriers and those opportunities. So the kinds of things that we're focusing on at the minute is looking at digital leadership across the sector, running a pilot program on leadership development. We are unfortunately having to work with a number of organisations in helping them mitigate the effects of online abuse, which increasingly cultural organisations are facing, particularly when they try and engage with audiences outside of their usual audience groups. We're doing work around sort of democratising access to cultural experiences. So, for example, taking VR experiences into public libraries, and also looking at online rights and how we can streamline the process of organisations clearing rights for digital projects. And obviously developments in AI technology and other things further complicate that sphere. I think on the flip side, there are great opportunities that we're trying to help organisations capitalise on in terms of how they can reach more diverse audiences, in how they can offer more accessible cultural experiences, both in terms of geography and price barriers, but also in terms of thinking about access needs. So we work a lot with disabled artists, looking at how we can use technology to create more inclusive experiences, both for the creators and for the audiences consuming them. And there's great opportunities around storytelling and narrative development where the cultural sector, individual artists and cultural organisations can help provide voice and contextualisation and address some of the themes that we're talking about today.
Thank you very much, John. And Carolyn?
Yes, thank you. My name is Carolyn Royston. I have been working in museums for probably the past 25 years. I'm from the UK, but I've been living in the United States for the past almost 10 years. Over the course of my career, I've worked at the V&A. I was head of digital for a number of years at the Imperial War Museums. And over in the US, I've worked at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York, and most recently at the Brooklyn Museum. And now I'm working with Peter at Surface Impression, and mostly consulting and continuing my work around really about how to build digital capacity and confidence in museums. I think for me, I'm been thinking a lot about the AI and its role, and feel like I'm in like the third digital transformation in museums. Like we've seen this movie before, and it's, for me, it's very much about how can we think about AI in terms of how it serves the mission of the organization, not get distracted by the shiny thing, which we so often do in museums. And we waste a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort on things that are really not sustainable financially or operationally. So I'm really interested in, how to support museums into thinking around that and around the skills and capacity that museums are going to need as we go into this next transformation, and what we can learn from the past, really, and not make the same mistakes again. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. And Kevin?
Yep. Hi. So the organisation that I'm with, Collections Trust, has its origins back in 1977 when a bunch of very far-sighted people could see that that computers were coming, and that it would be very important to have standards so that people cataloguing museum collections could record very, very diligently information about similar objects in precisely the same way, so that in years to come you would be able to search across those records. Nearly half a century later, neither of those things happen. So what we have are, we think, about 80 million computerized records, which are just a hot mess of semi-standardized data, currently sitting siloed in hundreds of museum databases. So in more recent years, Collections Trust has been working with Art UK and the Institute for Digital Culture to set up a new organisation, a free service called the Museum Data Service, which, among other things, is aiming to bring together all 80 million records from all the country, the UK's 1,700 accredited museums, and we're making no assumptions about who might want to use that information and how they might want to use it. So apart from a little light mapping, we are just the standpipe for any and all uses of that. So that has, transformational potential and some quite interesting implications for museums kind of letting go of being the key keepers of meaning of objects.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Kevin. So I want to pick up on something that both John and Carolyn mentioned, but we also heard a little bit about from the previous panel as well. So this is skills, but not only skills for the new generation of people entering the cultural industry, but also leadership skills, which is something that John talked a little bit about. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on how these new technologies like AI and advanced data analysis techniques are affecting the skills that are required, both for new hires and also for leadership in the cultural sector. Shall we start with Tom?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so kind of maybe reflecting on, so I've kind of a deep vested interest in this. So before I took on the CSA role at DCMS, so I've led the major kind of science and technology curriculum reform in Wales over the past 10 years. So I guess kind of thinking about this in a really deep kind of way around, what would you want to achieve at the end of compulsory education and provide, essentially creating future citizens of Wales, and actually how do you ensure that they are digitally competent, they have the ability to, it's not just viewing it in the sense of effective workers for the workforce, but actually just equipping them with the skills and the agency, kind of the empowerment to be able to kind of think about, a shifting world of work and the sort of the agility around roles and professions and kind of different tools and technologies coming around. So I guess that's kind of interesting how you're seeing the 4 education systems of the UK kind of really thinking about this. We sometimes get kind of mired in discussions about new GCSEs that will solve the panacea for all problems. If like a GCSE and AI will solve all these problems, like no. But I guess it's thinking about how, if you can, I think we are on the way to kind of doing that in an education and skills sense. What does that mean around the rest of the workforce and the rest of kind of society to kind of equip people, an AI literate citizenry is kind of interesting, or a data literate, media literate, a digitally literate kind of citizenry is a really interesting kind of question. I think I've seen this, so having sat on the boards as a non-exec director of a utilities company and a massive health board in Wales, is kind of, they are 2 really interesting kind of use cases around kind of board level kind of leadership and understanding of this sort of stuff. So you need to have that sort of digital kind of capability at the board level to understand what this means around how does this underpin and support like the business's strategy and its aspirations, but also in the sense of, for example, like a water company is clearly an infrastructure company, but also it's a data organization. So it has like telemetry and monitoring and sensing across the entirety of its network. How does that use things like data science and other things for kind of predictive capabilities and to be able to be more responsive to environmental issues, or kind of how its network is working more effectively. And then I guess like the health and social care is a great example around it should be very patient centered. But actually, how do people understand that if your national systems, your kind of a national clinical portal is down, or a data set doesn't work, you can't access any scans or any X-rays or any tests. So you see that kind of understanding of, this is like business continuity, this is resilience, this is how businesses work. So I guess really driving that forward in, across lots of different sectors and domains, but I think that's really, really clear and key for culture and creative industries more broadly, particularly when we think about kind of technology adoption and diffusion. So there are massive opportunities. Like clearly there's some significant challenges. So lots of fear and uncertainty around like the impact of AI, but actually I guess like what's the role of government? Clearly there is a role for government. What's the role for other organizations and bodies and kind of sector groupings to own some of this going forward. So I guess, I'm sure we'll kind of unpick some of those. We have things like industrial strategy, we have the technology adoption review, we have things like AI opportunities action plan. All of these are talking about skills and capability as well. So I guess like really keen to hear those like top down stuff, but I think like how can we hear some bottom up interventions too?
Yeah. So moving from policy to a cultural institution, what are your views on skills, Becky, and what is Smithsonian looking at, both from leadership skills and with new hires as well?
Yes, yeah, it's a great question. And as I mentioned regarding where we're focusing our attention and our transformation, I mentioned kind of one of the 4 key areas is on our workforce and how we're investing in our workforce and thinking about what skills they need and the competencies they need as we think about really setting them up for success. And we're looking at it in a few ways. And I'll say, the institution is huge, it's complex. And so there may be some, needs with us, but I think it's applicable to any small or large cultural institution that is grappling with, number one, I will say, one of the reasons for the investment into the office, at the time, leadership didn't understand exactly what they needed, but they knew they needed something. They needed an investment. And so with our office being created and starting to bring in new subject matter expertise, we were able to help them understand a big part of being literate and having data literacy and understanding, frankly, and having a muscle to pay attention to the trends and what's going on around us is important for resiliency and relevance. We really felt the need to see how the world around us was changing, how we needed to evolve as an institution to pay attention to that. And so from a leadership perspective, it's purely understanding the awareness of what's going on and the skill sets, and frankly, also having a willingness to invest in change and evolution, even though, that does not change the fact that our mission is still the same. It is the increase in diffusion of knowledge. But I often ask the question, what would we look like if we started today? And there's a tension there. You cannot start, we've got 180 years of history, and many of you have much more than that. But that doesn't mean that we can't continue to ask ourselves, how would we do this if we had a blank sheet of paper? And that allows our leadership to think differently about where we invest and the priorities that we make. Similarly, as we think about the teams and our structures, we begin to think very interdisciplinary. Majority of the people I'm bringing on, frankly, don't come from a traditional museum background. I'm bringing in a lot of technical subject matter expertise that can marry closely with our museum subject matter expertise. So we're putting a curator, historian next to a data scientist, and all of a sudden we're seeing different things happen. So from a capability standpoint, we're really interested in making sure that our museum professionals and librarians and archivists understand how to ask and take their expertise in asking good questions and allowing us to start to deploy data and data science and all these new technologies differently to advance to, that goes into the discovery. What can we learn that frankly we couldn't before because it would take us maybe a year or 2 years or 3 years to do the research. Now it takes an hour. Yeah. So it's a lot of the original kind of good research practice, but also understanding basically that we're in a blue sky scenario now, and the sky's the limit with technology.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Becky. And so, John, you talked a little bit about skills earlier. So can you expand upon some of those views and how you see the skills changing or the needs for skills changing moving forwards in industry?
I mean, in an interesting way, we were talking earlier around the leadership piece. It's the skills that you need to effectively sit across that are not necessarily specific to the current time. You talked about sort of cycles of development and change and transformation, Carolyn, and it's seeing that. So something like AI or specific, particularly complicated technology, and there are aspects of that that undoubtedly mean its impacts can be very broad. But for a leader, it's about understanding how to deal with change in an organization, how to embed that, how to think about an organization that might not be, you want to break down the silos of different departments or teams and get them to think more entrepreneurially. So how do you go about doing that? How are you using sort of user-centered design and thinking about how you're engaging with audiences or stakeholders and iterating? So that all those principles have kind of been sitting there, not quite forever, but certainly for the last couple of decades in sort of technology management and embedding it in an organization. And good leadership is about mapping that forward as new technologies come along. In the piece then about organizational skills more broadly, for the sorts of organizations we're working with, these are very small scale organizations. So they often don't have budget or resource to have digital specialists in-house. On the flip side, the cultural creative sector is gorgeously collaborative. So we're interested in models where they can share skills between them, where agencies like ourselves can come in and help support and give scale, similar to initiatives like Museum Data Service might be doing in terms of the collaboration and the impact of that collaboration. So you can be doing that. I think there's a really interesting thing around, in the context of this room, how the higher education sector and secondary education is training people up. As Tom was talking about the relevance of syllabus, the creative industry, the PEC just issued a report a few weeks back that shows that the sort of gap in employer skills need in this sector is greater than in other sectors. It's got a higher than average number of graduates in that workforce, but they're less qualified than in other sectors for the jobs that employers want them to do. And really interestingly, employers' plans to provide training to them are less than in other sectors. So it's a combination of the worst possible factors, and therefore an interesting sort of imperative of what do we do about that. And that's not just about making sure that academic syllabuses and education syllabus align with skills needs, which can be really hard to predict down the line and for those syllabuses to keep pace with technology adoption, but also how do we reskill and upskill the existing incumbent employees? This is not just about new talent coming up. So again, there's experiments we've been running with funding, West Midlands Combined Authority funding, working with a further education provider on skills boot camps around filming live performances and things like that, particular specialist cultural sector skills, where we know that the competent population, people with those skills, is coming up towards retirement, and there's an opportunity but also a need to replace them and replace those specialist skills. So it's thinking about those kind of interventions as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. And so, Carolyn, what are your thoughts on skills?
Yeah, I mean, agree with everything here. I mean, from my perspective, you know, I'm always thinking about the audience. I mean, from a museum background, what are our audience needs? They generally are, you know, outpace us in their expectations of what we're able to deliver. We're not technology companies. You know, we don't have, you know, we're not at the bleeding edge of technology, and we shouldn't be. So it's how do we keep up? And again, just coming back to this idea of staying on mission, and really making sure that, you know, when you're thinking about, you know, investing in technology, in innovation, you know, how does it align with the mission and meet audience needs, and also how do you measure the impact of that? Because I think then generally I found that it's easier to get buy-in from the leadership, particularly in America, where there's a very different funding model, you know, and it's often a scarcity mindset. So everybody's sort of like, you know, fighting for the same pot of money. You know, it's really being able to just demonstrate the need, and I think that you know, this idea really of introducing new roles, often in interstitial spaces. Museums are so old-fashioned in the way that they're organized. You know, it's kind of still a Victorian type of organizational structure. So starting to think about what's the connective tissue between departments, how do you break down silos, bringing in those new skills that then marry with, you know, the existing staff, and raising the capacity and confidence, so that this work is embedded in what people are doing. It's not like an added extra. And taking the burden off digital teams to be both the service providers for the whole organization and the people that have to teach the whole organization how to do it, which is an incredible emotional, you know, labor on top of just, you know, not having the time and energy. And, you know, just that leadership question really of helping, I mean, educating really your leadership in understanding what it takes to actually deliver on these projects. We used to say, oh, just do a tweet. And they didn't realize that, actually what was involved in writing one, in terms of time. So I think there's, as I said, I feel like we have seen this movie before. The same questions are still there. We need to learn from what the mistakes that we've made in the past, and really think about, what does a future vision for museums look like in terms of workforce.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Carolyn. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Kevin?
Just to reiterate the leadership message, I think everything starts with that. And I think, we started thinking about the Museum Data Service in 2015. I had, and Andy had, literally hundreds of conversations with people in cultural leaders in the sector and leading funding bodies. And I think, we could probably count on the fingers of one finger the number of people who actually got it. And it's very telling that actually it was Bloomberg Philanthropies, a philanthropic organization, built on, what the good things that happen when you bring data together and do stuff with it, who actually got it and instantly went, oh yeah, this sounds great, we'll fund that. So I think that has all sorts of implications for kind of policy and funding criteria. And, it is regrettably the case that it is relatively easy to get millions and millions of pounds for unstrategic, shiny stuff, with absolutely no plan at all for digital preservation, than it is to get relatively small amounts of stuff for the essential digital plumbing or relatively small things. And
why? Why is that still? Why are we still doing that?
Because the people who are deciding these things just still think that combining words and images on a web page is witchcraft.
But I remember, I remember going back to like Nof Digi, and when the heritage, the sort of beginnings of the Heritage Lottery Fund, where it was the people that were giving out the money had no understanding really of what they were funding.
Yep.
And they had this sort of vision, and so it ended up that there were just hundreds of unsustainable, not useful, nobody wanted them. I remember the British Museum digitized like 5 million coins that were all the same and put it online.
Yeah.
And I might have slightly exaggerated, but not by that much. And like it's like So
I think Tom was going to add to.
Just on that point, I guess, I totally agree. I mean, this is a perennial challenge with kind of, I guess, how governments tend to try and fund stuff. So it's obviously easier to spend capital than it is to spend basically revenue. So, you don't want to have these kind of, you don't want to sort of have long-term commitments in the sense of it's the financeability. It's much easier to say, we'll spend £10 million this year and that's kind of done. So I guess there's something that we need to shift that kind of sort of dialogue around, like what's useful spend of kind of public money. So and I think also you have to have we need to be better at articulating the importance of investing in things like data architecture and infrastructure. So it might not be the shiny stuff that a minister can stand in front of, but actually you can suddenly say, like, we've spent this on, which glues all this stuff together. It makes things work. It makes it sustainable. It's resilient. It's kind of, you can have data linkage. You can do some very cool citizen-centered stuff. It supports digital public services. It allows accessible, access to collections and everything else. So like data for the public good, all of it. But I think we have to be better at that narrative. And it's not just, I guess, convincing all of us because we're preaching to the converted. I think there's a broader societal debate to better articulate, like, this is why we're going to spend £150 million on this thing. You will never see anything from, but suddenly it will make, actually it will be the magic glue that suddenly has a genuine impact on culture and heritage, and people will be able to access things, and there will be also economic spillover. So, you'll start to see the benefits of this from a broader sort of economic perspective of the UK as well.
So I'm going to pick up on something that you talked about a little bit earlier, and then we're talking about using data and make it publicly available. And I know it's a subject close to Kevin's heart as well. A little bit about trust and ownership when we're dealing with all these huge amounts of data and obviously algorithms and AI that is trained on data sets. And I know there's been, lots of debate about IP and copyright, but also how do you gain the trust of the people who are working with those data sets, whether it's the professionals or the public?
Yeah, so I think the sort of enshrining or very explicitly talking about openness and transparency is critical. I mean, obviously, this is a very rapidly emerging area in the context of the AI IP kind of copyright review. Consultation just closed a week and a bit ago. So this is between IPO, DCIT, and DCMS. So we recognise there is likely to be at some point a change to regulation and legislation in this space. So I'd probably there's probably something to be said about the status quo is not a great position because there's lack of clarity about protecting creators' rights and intellectual property, but also ensuring that they can be effectively and fairly licensed and used for people can reap the benefits from that sort of creative intellectual property. I think more broadly when you're talking about kind of, I guess, public data or like the aggregation and combination of all these different data sets between different organizations, I think this overarching wrapper of the National Data Library, which is another kind of major kind of government sort of declaration and manifesto pledge, is just around like how do we articulate the benefits of this, and how do we make sure it's not about spending replicating existing investments in data infrastructure that we've done for a long time over recent years, leveraging things like Tank towards the national collection and Disco. So there's all these major kind of, we have sort of investments in infrastructure already, and also I suppose really clearly making sure this is like citizen-centered and it's about like there's all publicly understandable kind of openness and transparency. I know I'm not trivializing this. This is going to be painful and not very easy, but I think I guess at least there is an ambition and ambition to address some of the problems. So legislation is not currently perfect for this, but we are also operating in there's a global lots of different jurisdictions are going to do things in different ways. So there's a UK kind of competitiveness piece, but ultimately it's about you want to protect and enshrine creators' intellectual property and their data rights, and also the data rights of the public. But I think I guess there is that kind of broader debate and public kind of dialogue and discussion needs to happen. But I do think you have to always talk about openness and transparency and like kind of verifiability and auditability. So there's probably carrots. There's also some sticks that probably have to come around as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. So Kevin, I know you probably want to jump in here. So what are your thoughts on trust and ownership?
Yeah, I mean, although our system developers would probably disagree, I mean, the Museum Data Service, the main problem is not a technical one. It is that we've got 1,700 museums ranging from, big nationals, where you may well have, curators and collection managers who are very, very keen to be part of this, but then there are in-house lawyers and all sorts of people to be persuaded, down to kind of small volunteer-run organizations, and persuading them to part with what many of them still see as their data is a real challenge. And so we've addressed this in a couple of ways. The first thing is that in terms of copyright, they retain the rights, and we're not an open data project in the sense that we require the data to be published as CC0. So we love CC0 as users, but it's a deal breaker for many museums, and we know that. So we are happy for museums to publish on the open government license or CC BY or whatever they use. That's fine with us, and that at least gets the data out there. And then the other point, I mean, I think it would be unhelpful to our cause if commercial use of data were allowed for AI purposes. I think the current exemption is fine, and we can explain that to people, and they are generally very happy with the idea that non-commercial research use might be made of their data for AI. I think if they were to sort of be thinking, well, big tech are going to take our data and then sell it back to us and all that, I think that then becomes an added hurdle that we'd have to overcome.
Are there any other comments on ownership or trust?
I think there's just an interesting general point about scale for me. So if you think about the technical challenge around AI of this side and the power imbalances as well, this broadly big American tech firms coming in, scraping enormous amounts of data, and then somehow trying to put some transparency around the underlying ownership and rights on that data, that's a very intractable problem, but I think there's some really interesting use cases around small data sets and organizations who've identified a particular niche, who collect data from a relatively small group of contributors and look at the licensing and the IP and the commercialization of those data sets. And I can see some interesting experiments already in the cultural sector around that sort of scale. So I think that's interesting. And I think it's interesting in terms of the agile model of what Museum Data Service is doing, in that you're not sort of robustly cleansing all this data or setting that as a very high barrier. So you've got a relatively low barrier because you're focused on the barrier of trying to onboard people and get them to share data. And I think what you've got there is a very clever, light touch way of beginning to build quite a lot of momentum and quite a wide data set with relatively low technical risk, whereas other more ambitious attempts have come unstuck for much higher sort of price tags. And so I think there's those four things. And then just on that Creative Commons, so I think it's still the case, National Lottery Heritage Fund, if you receive funding from them to do digital projects, that's public money, and they want the outputs of that to be publicly available on a Creative Commons license, which the ethical principles of that seem fine, but what it inadvertently does is close down opportunities for organizations to be potentially entrepreneurial, to approach those rights in a different way. And so there's always that tension that I think we maybe need to be a little bit more flexible in how we approach those opportunities.
The only thing I'll add there from our perspective, because we, just like everyone else, are grappling with what does it look like to think about policy or ownership, and it often comes back down to rights and IP. And we have an interesting perspective as well, because our institution cuts across art, history, science, and culture. So you've got a lot of different disciplines with, frankly, different applications for AI. Whereas you hear in the art world a lot of worry and fear around copyright, whereas on the science and research side, there's this significant kind of open data movement and maybe less risk and more willingness for error. And so for us, we really try to base our thinking around what's the application of the AI and what is our risk tolerance, and thinking about how that applies to how we police or how we think about the ownership piece and trust. And I'll also just say too, when this all began and ChatGPT was released and we started this larger conversation around AI, core to everything we talked about was data quality and provenance, and understanding what is truth and what is good data, and owning that data and knowing the source, the source it came from. So we were also very keen to understand for the particular data that needed, especially when the models were showing so much inaccuracy. We really wanted to ensure that whatever we were putting out, we believe strongly in its quality, and that we could stand behind it in the event it was being scraped. So I do think we should never forget the conversation around what is the data that we are providing, and remembering the provenance of that as well.
Yep, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. I kind of want to pick up on something that you, Becky, were talking about a little bit earlier, and also something that Carolyn might be interested in. And that's particularly to do with relationships and changing relationships and changing roles of cultural institutions, but also the relationships between the cultural institutions and the other organizations that they work with, whether it's creators or other cultural organizations, or their audiences as well. So how is digital technology, the use and reliance on AI and data, changing these relationships across the cultural sector? And how is it changing the roles of cultural organizations themselves as well? I think if Carolyn could answer that first, that would be brilliant.
I'm sitting here and I keep thinking about when we were putting our collections online. There's a lot of the similarities, I think, in those conversations. We were first doing that, and it was like, no, you can't do it. No one will ever visit our institutions again. And people will take our collections and do terrible things with it online. And of course, that did not really come to pass, either of those things. So I think that it's in terms of, again, audience expectation and, what they're doing already, and how really the challenge for cultural organizations is how to just stay up to date, how to educate their own staff around the way that audiences are using, want to use their data, want to use the collections. And again, just, back to that point around really staying on mission.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And Becky, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's just, I agree with everything Carolyn mentioned. And and say that the Smithsonian's mission is the increase in diffusion of knowledge. And going back to that point about if we were to start it today, how do people access knowledge? How are we consuming information? It used to be locked up in research papers or in objects in museums. It's not the case anymore. So it's really incredibly important. And again, I do think this is not a new challenge. It's just a new variation of the same challenge, which is that if we want to actually go back to the core of our mission, and that's the mission across any of our different institutions, we do need to consider who are we trying to reach with this knowledge, and where are they, and how are they consuming information? It changed when they started using Google to ask questions instead of asking experts. And now we're at the point where Google's going to answer that, and they'll never even come to our web property. So it's significantly shifting who the authority on the answer is, and what is our part to play in creating that answer. And that is scary. But it goes back to, okay, well, then what is our part to play? How do we think about knowledge consumption and these incredibly important institutions across the world? How are we ensuring that that answer is accurate and sound and has a cited source? And so that means a different strategy internally and how we deploy resources, skill sets, capacity, capability, and frankly, asking these tough questions. Because you can imagine this could cause a bit of fear and anxiety amongst staff thinking, what does this mean? When it just means being more nimble, more adaptable, more willing to shift with what's changing around us so that we can continue at the end of the day to meet the mission.
Just kind of very quickly on that point, I guess there's there's an interesting responsibility about being like trusted authoritative institutions, because I guess, so DCMS, we have 42 arm's length bodies, and we, that would be Science Museum, Natural History Museum, V&A, I guess like the major national kind of culture and heritage organizations. So, I guess how do you, they are authoritative in lots of ways in what they do. So there is a lot of trust and responsibility. So that's kind of, how do you kind of project that in that sort of meta world where they might want to come to your website, but it could be kind of curated, scraped, kind of, digested, synthesized stuff from your content. So I think that's a different world than we've ever had to be in. So I guess so actually how active you are in that world and how maybe proactive you are. I'm not necessarily talking about kind of misinformation, disinformation, but just kind of being out there to demonstrate that kind of authoritative, kind of canonical sources of information. I guess I completely echo what kind of Carolyn said around, maybe being kind of fast followers or adopters of technology. So, I think the sector's pioneering in lots of ways, but there's something about kind of sustainability. So actually, it isn't just about buying the next shiny kind of technology, but then I guess how do you disseminate some of those things certainly across different sizes of museums and across the sector, but then how does that kind of permeate across, arts, gallery is another thing. So actually, like, how do you start to kind of diffuse some of those kind of technology initiatives? And it is about, you mentioned the kind of data and kind of, the sort of standards and this sort of stuff. Like this is a perennial problem with kind of actually having that broader impact across some of these sectors.
I mean, we are. I don't work in museums anymore, but it's still a we. We are. Trust. It is a lot of it is about our brand.
Yeah.
And being these trusted institutions, and part of our role should be about to be quite transparent about what we're doing, how we're managing our data, why we're doing it, the benefits to our audience. I mean, we are one of the areas where we can talk about it, and there is a degree of trust.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that if you're not where the audience is, you're not even in the game.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
So that gets back to the importance of prioritizing digitization, having digital records that are feeding into systems. Yeah. I definitely don't believe that we should be pioneering in any way some of these technologies that aren't very unique to our sector. But we also can't sit on the bench waiting, expecting that we are known institutions and therefore everyone will know that we are truth. That's where the relevance plays in, because the generations are shifting, and unless they're paying attention to how knowledge was used to be consumed, they're just going to assume that whatever is online is all that we know, and that is purely not true. So,
And if you think about, a young person who's actually in our physical gallery, they're probably in about 3 different worlds while they're standing there looking at an object, and operating on many different levels in a way that I'm not, and so again, it's like how do we keep pace with that and that expectation when we have a lot of competition, So, I mean, these are like really interesting questions.
That's brilliant. So a final question, because we've got to wind up in a minute, is so what positive steps should we be taking to ensure a prosperous and exciting future in the cultural sector?
Pay museum people more money.
It's a big. I mean, it's a big question. I guess. I mean, I think.
Or maybe for you, I should say, what steps are the government intending
exactly.
to take to ensure
we're
a prosperous
very keen to
cultural
listen. There's like top down and bottom up. But I mean, I think it's the opportunity around. I mean, something that I would probably echo that as Secretary of State, our Secretary of State's priorities around like shifting the dialogue around culture and heritage stuff is not a nice to have. So you need to kind of enshrine this as like it's axiomatic in the things that we do, and it's not the thing you scratch from the budget when you're in fiscally challenged times. So I guess, when we've done this many times in the past, we've kind of alluded to this, you have cycles where there's lots of money to kind of build stuff up and then the money disappears, or kind of economic conditions mean you have to start cutting back on stuff. And that's really detrimental when you think about the kind of colder spots of the UK that doesn't have much kind of culture and heritage infrastructure, or the accessibility of things like collections and artifacts and sort of, exhibits. So I guess we really need to make sure that this is, the UK is, we always talk about the UK being a global leader in this space, and kind of our culture and heritage assets and institutions, and the authoritative kind of the trust and the kind of pedigree and reputation. But I guess we need to back it and stand by that, and actually to recognise that these things have to be funded. So the sort of sustainable funding and investment in culture and heritage infrastructure and the culture and creative industries is a key. So we will get economic benefits, and there will be spillovers and all sorts in a multi-capital way. But actually, it's like we want a happy, healthy, productive society, and that's only going to be viewed by having kind of access to culture and heritage stuff.
Becky, have you got anything to add to help us achieve
I
that?
actually just completely echo. I want to echo and agree with that, because I do think it's specifically also around this idea around digital culture. I think that it's no longer nice to have, and it needs to be part of the core strategy and infrastructure of how the cultural sector sees itself connecting with the world. I think for a very long time, we looked at digital as an additive and an augmented what was a core experience, which was the physical space. And we're not there anymore. And it cannot be simply one-time investments in shiny initiatives that are easy to present at events later on. It's got to be something like the Institute of Digital Culture, which is now a sustained piece, or an office dedicated. This was a big change for the Smithsonian to actually dedicate a full office and full-time staff to thinking about this. That's not always possible with resources. However, it can be something that's built into strategic plans or into mission statements or in how institutions are thinking about fulfilling their mission. So I do think that's the shift, and a positive shift that can happen to really then allow and enable many of these advancements to take place.
Have you any last comments as well, John?
Yeah, and I was just thinking there's 3 things for me that should be focused on, and I promise I'm not being paid to say this, but I'm going to use the Museum Data Service as an example of how you do this. But the first is that the sector needs to be strategic, and I think that's probably, of the 3 things I'm going to mention, one of the things it's not always been so good at. So as you did with MDS, thinking about why you're doing it, what you're trying to achieve, and what the right level is to kind of pitch in at technically and in terms of getting people on board. Then the next point is about being collaborative. Given we're in a sort of financially constrained circumstances and that looks set to continue, it's again where I think the sector is strong, and how can you collaborate and partner with others. So again, MDS in terms of its founding partners, but also in trying to onboard and get that momentum of participants behind it. That's how you build that strength. And then the final thing is being playful and experimental, which again, the hackathon earlier in the week is a great example. Creatives, artists and so on, that's what they're brilliant at, is trying to work out how to push these technologies, to break them, to use them in unanticipated ways. So I think if you can combine those three things, then even with all the challenges we're facing at the minute, you've got some momentum there.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And Kevin, have you got any final thoughts?
Well, just that, in straitened times, we just need to really focus and be sure that the investment that is made, and we absolutely want that investment, is future-proofed. So, because otherwise, unless we can sort out this long-term strategy for digital preservation, everything that's happening now is going to be digital dust in less than 5 years. And I think, we could certainly borrow a trick from, say, the archaeology sector, the Archaeology Data Service. If developers deposit archaeological archives with that service, it comes with a dowry, which goes into an endowment fund, which then helps to fund the long-term preservation. So, one step that we could take tomorrow is to say, if we're funding new projects that have digital outputs, a proportion of that initial grant funding has to be put aside, goes into an endowment fund, which then makes sure that the outputs go into a trusted digital repository for the long term. And that feels like a very simple step that would actually be a game changer.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Kevin. And also thank you for Tom, thank you to Becky, and thank you to John, and thank you to Carolyn. Can you thank everyone, please? That's perfect. Thank you very much.